Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's been a little bit, huh? We haven't seen one another since Tuesday, but for some of you, it's been a little longer. Went to some conferences, made some connections, did some cool stuff, brought back some guests who were in another room, working with some other students here, Chris Partridge in particular. But today, for our intents and purposes, we're going to be working through design patterns. Now, we've gotten a bit of a ways through the semester, and so I trust you a little more on your design patterns, or at least the kind of skill set you've been developing. And so I'm going to be a little more hands-on, and I'm going to guide you in being a little more hands-on yourself. So we're going to be training slightly different skill sets while we're developing design patterns. In particular, today, I'm going to be focusing on how to criticize design patterns, which is a very useful skill. I'll remind you guidelines when we're thinking about within the context of BFO, design patterns generally. And for this case, instead of looking at this as a stepwise procedure for building, because we're going to be talking about criticizing design patterns, you should instead use this as something of a list to check off things that may or may not be missing. So, material entities, qualities, processes, things that bear qualities, what those things can do, what sorts of processes they might be realized in, as well as places they might be located over time, and the ways we might talk about it today. Okay, I'm going to teach you some new skills, but I need some background to do so. Dogmatist academics and skeptics. If you're philosophically inclined, this may be a bit of old hat, but I suspect for many of you it will be new hat. So a dogmatist. I want you to keep this framing in mind. A dogmatist is the way we'll talk about it here. Is born out of like traditional philosophy. There was a school of thought called dogmatism that emerged after Socrates passed away, after Aristotle had written about him, after Plato had written about him. And the dogmatists thought they were doing what Socrates was doing. And they thought what Socrates did was take positive positions about things. For example, a dogmatist might have defended something like there is a God, or trade tariffs are economically feasible. Positive claims. Stoics are a good example of this. They like to assert things and then build systems on top of other systems like hands and gloves. Academics were kind of on the other side. This was another school of thought. Academics take negative positions to defend. They say things like there is no God, or trade tariffs are not economically feasible. A characteristic example of this would be, Cicero. Cicero, famous Roman senator, famous for many reasons, one of which his loud mouth, because he got his tongue chopped off and his hands placed on the rostrum. But that aside, he was a bit of an academic. He was like regularly poking holes in arguments. He was quite good at it. And this school of thought focused on that. Basically, too, also thinking they were following in Socrates' footsteps, because what's one of the famous things Socrates said? What do I know that I don't? Now, contrast both with the skeptics, Pyrrhus being a good example of this, Sextus Empiricus being another example of this. Skeptics claim that both dogmatists and academics are mistaken. Skeptics seek to undermine positive or negative arguments. They're always seeking equivalence or balance across arguments. Why? They thought they were doing what Socrates was doing, and they thought Socrates was always searching. And if you come down one way or the other, you are no longer, you're closing off exploration and curiosity. And so their goal, their like kind of virtue that they sought was to always be exploring. So they thought they found good and bad arguments for good or bad positions. They did it in a balanced way. Now, we're going to be practicing refining and criticizing design patterns and defending them. And so I would like for you to organize into groups of at least 3. And I want you to take up these positions: dogmatist, academics, skeptic. And if we can't do it, then dogmatist and academics. And then I'll come play the skeptic. And what we'll be doing more specifically is I will provide you a design pattern to discuss. And then dogmatists will be defending the choices made, like why classes are there, why relationships have been included. Academics will do the opposite. You're gonna be the Debbie Downers. You're gonna be shooting things down, and the skeptics are not gonna let either of you win. No. Any questions about that before I proceed?
Yeah, can I be skeptical that we should break into groups of 3? We should do 2, and then skeptics.
Get out.
What?
No. We're gonna do the thing that I put on the slide. Yeah, I'm not being a dogmatist. Poor Ann.
I don't
Any
know, it's kinda
questions?
doubtful.
Indeed. I don't even have beliefs.
These are-
Beliefs are like so over. Anyway. So, okay, no questions? Good, good, good. Here's your design pattern. I'm not going to tell you what it's about. You should be able to infer what it's about, but I'll give you some pointers. You may want to look at Common Core ontologies for some of the terms, because they are from Common Core ontologies. So that'll give you some ideas about what the meaning of this is. It'll, for instance, tell you what active movement is. That'll give you some insight into what's going on, but also why it's placed where it is and why, say, operating posture prescribes such a thing. So, and if you're on the academic side, you can look around and be like, is that how we should model that? Maybe you get the idea of why, like an operating posture prescribing an active movement, but is that the best way to model this? Is that the only way to model this? Why did you model it that way? And then the skeptic will just be laying in wait. Anybody who gets a little edge here, they'll push back. Other side, push back. The skeptic position, incidentally, is the hardest position for people to maintain, I find. I don't have trouble with it because I'm a troll. But if you don't have the troll in you, you'll find yourself leaning one way or the other. I will walk around and I will make sure that if you're the skeptic, you stay skeptical. Because like I said, I'm a natural troll. So go forth. Get your bearings. I think we have somewhat of a natural setup here. You guys can see the screen, right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great.
Just
I'll assume you'll be the group, all four of you. But you'll still have to identify the roles, right? So you can have more than one dogmatist, academic, skeptic. So that's fine.
Okay.
Nobody should have more than one role.
My thought is.
I'll be the dogmatist because I like this
I like because it took me.
pattern so far.
Some time to figure out about what it was
No,
talking about.
I disagree.
I'm not sure how to argue for it though.
So I think you're an academic. Sometimes summary, yes, but summary is-
I'm the dogmatist.
Yeah. I might be the skeptic.
I don't know who I can't really hear you, but it sounds like you're talking.
Oh yeah, I was saying John should like reduce his mic so that way we can hear each other and go back and forth.
You want me to
Okay.
You
We
want
can
me to
also use
reduce my
the
mic?
text chat too.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I will.
So. We're.
Here, I can lower the volume. I think.
So we should at least. just-
All right.
So I'm glancing through the Common Core ontology here. I think a lot of the relations are correct here. So I mean that's an easy place to start. Let's see. Act.
Various vehicle range, participate, subset, out of movement. Operating posture, directing from your content.
I'm gonna look and act. Okay. I'm not sure what an operating posture is in this context, but so yeah, that'd be like the submarine is they're under orders, they're underway. That would be like the operating postures. Like we have a destination and like a reason for existing right now.
Yeah. The formal specification has part maximal range.
Hmm. Hmm. Turn my video back on. Get all personal. I just love the lights. My favorite
I
part.
mean, I love it too. So
I'm pretending to be a Bills fan.
Who's playing? Who's playing what role?
I grabbed onto Dogmatist because I just my gut reaction initially was I liked the pattern
Well, then I
with
kind
no
of,
qualification, so I need to qualify it now.
I'll kind of the academic, so I'll say the opposite. Let's say, maybe we should model it from the platform instead of the performance specification.
Ah, okay.
So
I would defend the design.
So
Um,
what? Why would you start with the platform?
because we have a solid entity of submarine, and then it would have certain performance and operating postures.
Because it seems to me like this is more like the focus is for this pattern the performance specification rather than the the object itself. Like because the only thing that is actually listed as a type is the directive information content entity. So this seems like a pattern of the specification, not the submarine.
But as an academic, I think we should be looking at um, the real entity of submarine.
Hmm. Let's see. I mean, depending on the domain or like the reason for making this specific pattern, um, there may be a reason to only look at the um, like the qualities and the capabilities as opposed to like because if I'm thinking of like if you start with the platform, then I feel like you're probably going to be more interested in building out kind of the mechanical functions of it more than like the more abstract capabilities that like a decision maker might want to work with. Not that I mean, you probably want both design patterns, but I think this one is specifically looking more at things like capabilities or operating parameters and all that. It seems to be just part of a larger pattern, obviously.
So, all right, so let's go from the performance side of things.
Mhm.
So since I'm playing the academic role and I'm trying to disagree with everything that's being,
I find it hard because I also want to find some things to disagree with here, but
I know,
we'll stick to my guns.
well, like a propulsion function, right?
Mhm.
Propulsion system, right? We're talking about performance. You know, is that something that, we would even need, especially in this example, because we're talking about a submarine as, I don't think that, if you're talking about US capabilities or capabilities that are out there, I don't think we're too concerned with diesel submarines
Um, I mean,
or
it doesn't
electric.
it doesn't imply diesel, but it does relate directly to, its ultimate speed profile and things related to that, which is important in terms of how quickly can you get somewhere. I think that's important.
Yeah, but the pieces that are used are propulsion function and propulsion system.
Hmm.
I would say simplify it and just get rid of those.
I wouldn't get rid of those because those are very you can't tell what kind of system is being used if you don't break them down.
Because they are looking specifically at speed and range, and I think out of any system on a submarine, propulsion is probably the one you want to look at. Yeah, this does seem like it seems very very focused on that exact piece of the submarine.
Let's pause for a second. I just want to make sure. I want to see what you guys think this design pattern is about. I want to hear what you think it's about. Just so I make sure that we're talking, we've gotten to that point. So who wants to venture a guess about what this is modeling? Yes.
Speed or motion of a submarine.
Like a specific speed?
Yeah, like a specific speed.
Like, okay, so one answer here is that there's a submarine that is in motion, it's moving, and like 34 knots presumably is the speed of that, say, at a time.
Mhm.
Okay, anybody else?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ian.
I was going to say it's more about the capabilities, I think, of like the design pattern or design specifications of like speed and range.
So like what it could do.
Yeah.
Rather than what it is doing, right?
Right.
So you have like a range of things, like a range of capabilities, like a range of speed. And one interpretation of this is that this is, say, the max speed.
Yeah, I agree with Ian saying that, because it's got the economical speed specification, right?
Yeah.
That, it's not just the speed, it's also, the range, duty cycle, since we're talking about a submarine, we did talk a little bit. I mean, you could have an electric submarine, right? You could have a diesel submarine, you could have a nuke, and those all have a different specifications and much different performance profiles.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think this is about, I'm gonna use the word, but a blueprint for making or describing a sub and separating them into, like, basically trying to figure out, like, this particular submarine, this is all of the, like, relevant data to build or specify that type of sub from another type of sub. And it's about that kind of blueprinting nonsense.
To my ears, this sounds very similar to the specification that language that Ian and Mike were talking about, because it is something you can characterize this as the sort of features or qualities that you might expect in a sub of this model or some model. Right. And so like when we create blueprints for cars, for instance, like Honda Civics go this fast, like they can go this fast. Doesn't mean they do, could sit on a lot forever, right? But they could. And we're trying to create, like, put together qualities of things in such a way that instances would be witnesses for that kind of speed profile. So I think that lines up pretty closely with what Ian and Mike were talking about.
I just meant that I think this is actually about the blueprint itself, less about the sub.
Yeah, I see that too. I mean, although there is a submarine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it may be both, right? Yeah.
I think in a way both are right, because it's still about a submarine, but there is economical speed specification, which I feel like you would use if you're trying to like understand how efficient a certain vehicle is.
Yeah.
And this, like I told you, I couldn't think of the word capability, but yeah, I was thinking about that, and that would make sense to me if I'm trying to understand how I could use a specific vehicle and its capabilities and what is needed from another like department or something.
Right.
Like, that makes sense.
Okay, so we have like two, this is good. So we have, two interpretations. I think these two line up. Now, this is not to say that your interpretation, I'm not
agreeing with Matthew on the blueprint because of the direct device content MC.
Okay.
You're
Well,
looking
I
at
do want to
the-
say though, like if you have some leaning still towards the other interpretation, the manner in which you proceed is sorting that out, explaining why they're wrong. Yeah, explaining why your interpretation is better. I think you'll have a hard time in this case, but it's I guess the lesson here would be, don't concede unless you're convinced.
Right.
And how do you get convinced? You work through it. Sounds like you might have already worked through it, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's not so easy. So, okay, well then, good. I think we're on the same page in terms of what this, oh, look, my thumbs up. Didn't mean to do that, but I think we're on the same page with respect to what this is about, or should putatively what the design pattern is about. So continue working through skeptics, dogmatists, academics.
Should.
Okay, I've said my piece.
So I actually agree, even though I'm supposed to be on the academic side, I do agree because I think you can change the, from using this model for a decision of where you're going to place a platform, right?
Mhm.
So you have different platforms. You have submarine, you might have some sort of surface ship, right? You might have, and where it operates and the economical speed. So if you have something and you're trying to decide where do you put a certain type of weapons platform or something like that, if you're going to use a shorter range type ICBM or something like that that needs to be patrolling out, you don't want to put it on a ship, a surface ship that doesn't have the the speed or the economical speed, the speed specification, the ability to stay out on point for a long period of time.
Mhm.
You don't want that platform to have to come back into port. So I think this, from an academic side, I think I'm agreeing with on the dogmatic side of things that, it is a good model. But is there something else if, if we're using this as a way to decide what platform is going to be used for a
Mhm.
mission or something like that? Is there something that we're missing here? Should we have
Right.
something else? So, and I would say that, maybe,
Right. Insufficient. Yeah, maybe.
uh, if you're trying to, you know, so, so you have the different branches of the service, right? So, and, but, if you're Space Force, right? You're Space Force, you're saying, well, hey, you give us the weapons platform, we can position it anywhere in the world, and within a certain amount of time, be able to hit a target or something like that. I know that violates a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm an academic, so I don't have to follow the rules.
Exactly. Okay. Do we have a skeptic?
I want to be a skeptic.
So you start with you're both wrong. Here's
No, it's like tell me more about that, or it's asking questions, right?
yeah, be wishy-washy. Do it.
Yeah, see, we're both right, both wrong in the same sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess we could kind of like focus in on what's not here. Maybe a
Mhm.
little bit.
Okay. So like, hmm. So like if say we are interested in what I think this is describing, which would be speed and range, is what's here sufficient enough to like do all of that even? Maybe
Right.
maybe there's more consideration, like he was saying. That's one thing I would consider is whether even something simple as like even what's here are like the relations correct or
Well,
enough.
yeah, there is that
Like
too. Like
so.
I was trying to pick apart some of the like making sure the directional of like each part of or has part or what have you
Mhm.
makes sense. And for the most part it seems to. Um but I guess the skeptic would be like, is this simplified enough?
Mhm.
Or is this too simplified for like how complex this particular, design would need to be to fully model what we're trying to model?
That was perfect because you said it's too simple and it's too complex in the same.
Right? That's like a typical skeptic, yeah? Let me play devil's advocate with myself.
It does seem interesting that like they specify like a value for this for the speed specification, but like it not for like range, which is
Yeah.
interesting that like they incorporated range and speed, but didn't, I don't know, didn't seek out to identify a particular parameter
Mhm.
value. uh, so yeah, I guess it seems like somebody was maybe in the middle of making this and got stopped so they could teach a class or something.
Or something. Or something.
Well, and it also might be, depending on what the request was, right?
Yeah.
It might be, since we are talking about submarines, right? And most likely we're not talking about, the Los Angeles class or boomer subs, the ICBM subs. We're talking about, either like a fast attack type sub or something like that. How quickly can that submarine platform be moved to a certain part of the world, right? So,
Mhm.
Right.
if it's docked in Hawaii, right? It's at Pearl, how long is it going to take it to get to the Sea of China, right? Or how long is it going to take to get off the coast of Korea or Japan or wherever, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I think that, and this is the difficulty that I have, right? Is that, a lot of times the questions that are being asked dictate the layout. And it can, you're asking a specific question. So it's hard. We're kind of guessing at, it's economical speed, specification, and it's knots, right? How fast something can get someplace. So is it how fast can a submarine, right, get to, a place where it's needed, right?
I'm gonna put on my skip. It's an Adidas. Um, so there seems to be. I'm looking up stasis now. It seems weird that stasis is a part of an active movement. If I was to critique something, or at least like request more information about that decision.
Yeah, I agree, right? Does it matter if
Stasis,
it's submerged
it,
or not? And actually, from the academic side, I'm gonna say, right, you have
yeah.
a submerged stasis, right? But that is going to impact your speed. So you can't have a value of 34 knots
hmm
if your stasis is going to change, because surface speed is different than underwater speed,
Right.
submerged speed.
Oh yeah,
Well,
that is.
and stasis in a fluid might not be an absolute stasis at all. So the stasis would be like kind of a state of not using propulsion or something. I would assume it's like maybe it's not, maybe it's not in the terms of movement. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what stasis means in this context. But trying to look. Process in which one or more independent continuums endure in an unchanging condition. Which, if it's a
Yeah.
part of an active movement
But
is the position or location of some changing object or an object. Like the location is changing, like it's defined that way.
I guess if we think about movement as like a linear line for
Yeah.
sake of picturing it,
Yeah.
stasis would be basically on either, it's like a point on
Like a
either.
boundary, yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than
Mhm.
like the class of stasis as it's defined.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So that
Yeah.
they're dimensionally different, I guess, in
There
that
might
way.
be a weird like a terminology change that I might suggest there.
Hmm.
I would bet to
'Cause
this.
I mean, it seems like a process boundary is what I would, if we're talking about stasis being it's not moving, that would be a process boundary for an active movement, right?
Obi, were you saying something?
Yes. So just because water have buoyancy, right? So the time it takes for it to like be static inside water.
Mhm.
By default, the water is going to want to push it up, right? So
Right.
you still need that submerged stasis to be there because part of the since you're going to calculate when the deeper you go, the more the submarine will be in constant stasis, even though it's moving or not moving.
Right. Hmm.
So maybe the submerged status is just to, even though we're not seeing it here, has to be defined in order to get the maximum range specification of the 34 knots, right? So even though we're not seeing whether it's, on the surface or it's below the surface, maybe that's what's is determining the maximum range.
Hmm. Yeah, I need to think about that. Can you rephrase that?
So the idea that the reason why we have submerged status on this is just to help dictate that eventual maximum range specification, right? Of 34 knots, right?
Stasis or status?
Stasis.
Okay.
So the submerged stasis, right? So I'm saying that the submerged stasis is, on the surface or submerged, right? And that's depending on what that stasis is, or that affects the maximum range specification.
I think I'm kind of not necessarily thinking of the same thing, but in a similar way, that stasis here can't truly be, one point, because if you're submerged, there's a current. There's going to be, yeah. Yes, John, I see your comment. uh so there is movement involved in this, in the sense of what we're submerged in.
Right.
But if we're talking specifically about the submarine, and its experience or process of stasis, that's different than necessarily the process of the water.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, and also I would say even the submerged portion is not a requirement to describe like whether it can move or like what its range.
Right.
Like it can operate, you know, um
it does what it does.
There's submerged and it can go on top of the water too, not on
yes.
top. But like yes. I forget the term. The opposite of submerged.
Did everybody see John's comment in the chat?
Yes. I think we don't need it though. I'll argue for it.
Say that again.
I said I will argue for it. I think we need it.
Okay.
My reasoning will be the deeper you go submerged, the more probably, I haven't looked into this, the more knots you need, and that reduces your distance. Like when you drive a car, the faster you go, the less distance you have. So I feel like the deeper you go, the more knots you need to propel your submarine from one point to the other.
Okay.
I mean, if we
help me, it's Jay.
Oh.
Hi, Jay.
Hey, Jay.
Are we in a breakout room?
Nope.
Not breakout, but we're I think the class is muted right now, so we can hear each other.
Oh, okay. I'll just listen then.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're looking at I'm assuming that you can't see the diagram on the screen, but we're looking at a directive of information content entity, and it's of a submarine, and it's got performance specifications and movement and speed profile, and we're taking different roles of either being a skeptic, a dogmatist, or an academic, and and so we're trying to tear it apart.
And what, trying to pick it apart?
Yeah.
Yeah, defend it or attack it, or whatever. Make whatever case we want to make.
Yeah, so, we have to have some way, as the active movement, the submerged status or the propulsion function, right, are the two things that link back to the submarine. But the submerged stasis, do we really need the submerged stasis? That was something that John threw in the chat, right? If we don't have the submerged stasis, we could simplify it and we still could get that maximum range specification, which has that value of 34 knots.
I don't think if you remove the submerged stasis, you will ever get to 34 knots. Like, you will get to 34 knots at some point, but you won't be able to calculate when you're on top of the water and when you're submerged. So I think you deal with different things depending on where you are in the water. Are you on top of the water? Are you submerged in the water? Or how deep you are in the water?
Sure, if we get rid of that stasis, though, it does simplify things, right? From an academic standpoint, and we say, we don't have the stasis and we still have the 34 knots, right? We're not in the model, we're not specifying whether or not the platform has to be submerged or on the surface.
The maximum range will stay the same no matter what.
Yeah. Even though we know that the surface speed would be greater, we would just say that for this platform, that's the maximum speed, right? Now, the maximum speed, right, most likely is going to be if they try to move a weapons platform from one area to another, how fast can it move, right? Well, it can move at 34 knots, right? And if we don't have the submerged stasis, then, it still moves at 34 knots. That's the fastest that platform can move. Now, whether or not it has to be submerged because it's got to be done covertly or not, that's separate.
So John says maximum range of what? You're talking about speed, like the maximum.
If we drop
limit of speed, right?
If we drop the stasis out,
yeah,
that changes the design pattern, right? Like,
yeah.
it's at least not clear, or it's at least a little ambiguous what you're measuring, man. So I say, if the claim is like it moves 34 knots, generally speaking, I think that's false. Different environments, it's going to have a maximum range of that's different, and it may move differently underwater than it would over. And so there may be some qualification that's removed if you drop out the stasis.
But wouldn't the specification would remain the same, right? Because that's kind of like a design sort of.
Maybe it depends on what you're talking about. So what specification? That's why I said maximum specification with respect to what? The design pattern as stated, I think you kind of have an idea of what's being specified, but if you drop that out, as I was suggesting a minute ago, then it's not clear exactly what you're talking about. So if I were an academic, I would say something like, or a skeptic, I would say something like, one, I would come in here and drop some chaos by saying, hey, think about dropping stasis. But two, I would then if you took the bait, I would say, well, now isn't your design pattern like at least useless almost? Like, what specification with respect to what? Now you're either saying something false or you're saying something unclear. Yeah.
Because I'm taking the side of the academic. The side of the academic, I'm like, well, this all occurs in an ideal environment. No friction,
Yeah.
No current fighting against you. Yeah.
And it's okay to idealize, right? Like, these design patterns are going to be idealizations, but some idealizations are better than others. And sometimes when you idealize and you abstract too much of the details, like what context you're talking about the maximum specification within, then you can putatively come up with a kind of a useless design pattern or one that's going to generate confusion. So you do need some context, even if it's like not calculating friction constants and all that good stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement, though, even though we're trying to play the different roles. I think we're all in agreement that submerged stasis has to be there, or the model.
Good. Or at least something like it, some contextual parameter. Yeah, good. All right.
Well, I mean, would you also add a stasis around things like current or temperature?
Maybe. Would that affect the maximum specification range? So this is going to get into what Mike was pointing to about like the levels of like abstraction.
Well, so
Right. Go for it.
If I'm an admiral, John, John, if I'm an admiral, right, I don't really care what the maximum specification of a ship is. What I care about is I need cover at a location in 9 hours when you get there. That's all I care about, right? So if that's the case, then you need to build in all the variables that are going to disallow or allow it to travel faster or slower, right? So like if I'm running sorties over Iraq, right, I really care about what the jet stream is. Because if I'm looking over St. Louis, the jet stream, if I'm going with the jet stream or against it, it could change that flight by hours.
Yeah. What good complications to work through? Where do you draw the line? You might think about specific. So one thing I'm pulling out of what Jay is saying is there different competency questions that would be relevant to different groups.
Yeah.
Some of those might be better answered by this design pattern. Some might be better answered by others. And so there's kind of an adjudication. You might approach it this way if you're like maybe looking at this from a skeptical lens, like the range of plausible competency questions that would be answered by something like this is not broad enough. Or if you're looking at it from the defense position, it is. It actually captures quite a bit. And adding more noise would just add noise, and that would overcomplicate things and add like edges and nodes that would move in different circumstances, and so it'd just be more work down the stream. So, but there's the balancing act.
Or
fight it out.
Could you modularize the design pattern, John?
That's a great idea.
Could you make the specification of the vehicle its own self, and then you would make other design patterns that would implement with it? So, for example, the way that a submarine interacted in, say, the South China Sea is different than the way it deals in the Arctic, right? So you then would have a
system of
and so you could then put that Nimitz class submarine or whatever you're dealing with in those two situations independently, and still use the same overall design pattern for the max specification.
That's right. But now let's keep in mind, now you're talking about additional work, and you're talking about like how this design pattern is used. So what you've described is certainly a useful strategy. But now there's some ways to do that better than others, and some starting points that are better than others. And it's also a lot of work to manage and maintain. And like if you change things, you got to change two of these. And so these are considerations.
One thing we always try to do is not boil the ocean. That's not boiling the ocean though, John, because say, for example, if I'm building this for South China Sea with two patterns, then I could say, now it's modularized. So now if anybody else wants to build this for, the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean or whatever, they can go do that. And they don't have to build the other half of it. Yeah.
So the claims, so I agree with you in spirit, but some of those claims that you're making about the utility, the broad utility, those are the sorts of things, if I were being an academic or skeptic, I would be poking at. Because I would want to explore the extent to which it sounds true. But think about whether it is. And I will let you do that. I'll be back.
Yeah, so say the idea of adding in all these things, that makes the model more complex, right? So we have a speed, and either we're going to look at it in an ideal situation in a simplistic way so people can grasp the higher level information out, or we can start to get down and, as you said, boil the ocean or get too many things in there, right? So the idea of, if you're operating, there's currents in the ocean and things like that. There's other things, just like when you're flying through the air. It can have a significant impact, right? Even though we're saying that the boat can travel at 34 knots, well, there's things in the way. There's things underwater that are in the way if it has to be submerged. There's land masses that are in the way. Certainly, if you're trying to move something from, the port of Los Angeles to Norfolk or something like that. I mean, it might look like there's a short distance, but it's kind of hard to take a submarine across the continent, right? You're going to have to be going around. So, how detailed do you get in your model, right?
And this is why I was thinking why this design pattern shouldn't have like a platform specific focus as opposed to the performance specification. Or I think the case is it is more focused on the specification, because this would be an example of like if you're writing policy for decision makers, I'm thinking from the context of like the Coast Guard, right? So you have like response boats that have certain operating ranges of like, hey, you can operate in these kind of waves or whatever, this height of waves or whatever. That's going to give you something on paper with which to make like policies that drive like liabilities and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that like you can't exceed those in certain circumstances, and you don't want to be chasing those down to try to capture every sort of what if thing that can happen in any circumstance, right? I think it's more important to capture like the stuff that you can write something like a policy around or conduct training on that is standardized.
I think it just depends upon how you look at these ontologies and how you look at these modules. Because, like, if you come from an approach, like, I think about, like, when Ford was building bombers in World War II, and they wanted to have all these different design specifications, and it was, like, impossible for them to get anything through the assembly line until they came up with this modularized approach and said, hey, the chassis all the same, and then we have a type A, B, C, and D. And if you need 10 type A's, once it gets to this point, we're going to send it over to the type A line, the type B line, the type C line. I think you need to look at this the same way. Like, always have an eye for, like, hey, what is higher level here? What is really low level? And build towards that so that you can modularize your build. Because I do think that this probably is like maybe multiple design patterns you're combining into one to get to a final result. And if you just bake that in for one use case, and then you also want to build it based upon your key intelligence questions and answering those, right? But I think you want to always have an ear for how this is going to be reused in the future by other people. I think that's always a smart way to look at it.
So you would argue for like for example, a submarine operating in different parts of the world, like specifying like recommended maximum ranges or something, like trying to nail down like how the environment would actually affect it.
No. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm saying that you know, coming out of the submarine's going to have maximum everything, right? Maximum depth, range, everything. Now, I'm not an environmental scientist, right? I don't know if that hull can withstand a maximum depth at, 31 degrees or 32 degrees better than it can at 45 degrees. I don't know. I don't know the answer to those questions. But
right.
If there are changes there, that's not in your original model. I think your original model is more like Bill was saying, like utopian, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is perfect. And then you build other models to interact with that add in all of these variables. Bill, is that what you would suggest to do?
You mean
Tim here? I can't see anything, but I mean, based on discussion, I generally agree with simplicity first, right? You're going to have another layer of environmental factors which impede speed and capabilities of a submarine. You're going to have constraints imposed by the AOR that you're operating within, and you're also going to have, mission-specific parameters that limit maybe speed because of noise. So those seem to be like layers that you would apply on top of it. So I think the approach would be to do the design pattern that is applicable and then apply constraints as you narrow down the key intelligence question you're trying to answer. Over.
But that wouldn't require necessarily changing the design pattern. That would be a question of like query constraints or something, right? Placed over what is already listed as like a maximum range or maximum specification or whatever.
Yeah. I'm saying keep it simple and then apply the constraints.
Right. Okay, I agree with that.
So you probably want to have dispositions for like screw noise and speed, and those would probably have domains and ranges that interact with each other and have object property assertions that are interrelated, right? Like the
Right.
faster it goes, the louder the screw is probably going to be. And like
Right.
Tim said, if you need to stay under a certain decibel because you know that a certain enemy can find your location once it's at a certain like decibel level, then
Right.
you know you're probably going to be in that AOR. You're going to be constrained to a certain speed, right? That's going to be important. But that can be,
Yeah.
you know, you'd probably want to have the dispositions that the vehicle can that it has be in the original model, and then have all these other constraints outside of it, you know.
So
And that gets back to
you
the
you would
basis
you would
of whether or not
modularize
it's
though
merged or
in
not.
order to show those constraints. Is that what you're saying? Like you would build a different.
I would modularize it. Yeah, you got to
To
realize
reflect
too. I'm
physical-
coming from I'm coming from the perspective of somebody who's running a foundry, and I'm not running mission use cases. And I think when you're running mission use cases, you want to get things done quickly, and so it makes more sense in the moment to just build it all into one model. But then the problem, if you build it all into one model, it's really hard sometimes to unstick it and pull it back apart. When if you build it modularly, it's easier just to go and slap those things together like overlays. But it might be more building overlays in real time. It might just take a little bit more pre-planning to build those overlays in real time.
The system is.
I would do it. So what I would do, I would probably 3 files and I would space, and then I would have my secondary and my tertiary, and so I would have them in overlay. So I would probably have massive arguments with people like Tim on my team about, hey, what are things that are extemporary, circumstantial things that don't have to go to this base model, and then build from that. But try to be really, really tight on scope of the base.
Not
So-
to abruptly change the topic, but I am curious. I dropped a question in the chat and I'm curious.
Yeah.
Think about it.
So for you on audio there, he says, how does economical speed
what's the question?
specification relate to performance specification, and should it relate?
It should.
It's so
no
economical seems
Economic
evaluative.
specifications?
Yes, economical speed would be when your car is like cruising and just like not ramping it up. And when you're not doing that, you're just in sport mode and you want to go fast, right? So with that, it's more like I'm settling, I'm cruising, I'm not actually using more force. So that's what I see from that. And it's like straightforward.
Well, I think there's an easy answer to that. If you're in an AOR and you only have one tanker, and that tanker is 300 knots from you, you got to be careful that you're not going to run out of fuel before you can go back to that tanker. Now, obviously, if you're in a nuclear submarine, then you have your own fuel source. But you know, there's going to be constraints depending upon the machinery you're using, right? Like helicopters, they might be able to just hover at a slower speed for a much longer period of time if they're looking for maybe a shipwreck or something. But if they go much faster, they might run their fuel. So I think it comes down to, like, you know, how are you going to be able to operate the best, you know, in your environment? And at some points you might have to go faster to get away from an enemy, but in other times you're going to want to be able to sustain your mission, and you're you know, you're going to have to be careful with that.
So what does it mean then when there's a node that is specifically an economical speed specification? It seems like it kind of depends on the context. What would be specified at any given time? Like I'm
Well, I think you're
as opposed to
like
different than
cruising
performance.
altitude.
What's that? Oh, cruising altitude.
So right. So like submarines have a maintenance schedule, right? And if you go on a 6-month deployment, like that boat's got to come back and undergo a significant overhaul, right? You also have food for the people on it. You can have power, but those systems need maintenance depending upon, you know, how they're driven during their rotation, right? So imagine if you're redlining your car all the time, right? You're gonna need oil changes a lot faster. So if the economic constraints essentially are saying, I want you to operate in this area, for as long as possible, then you're gonna operate differently, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think
So those constraints
take the
exist based
example
on
of
mission parameters. Go ahead.
take the example of the second Top Gun movie, right? So everyone's seen it. So when they're doing the final sortie, right, they have to fly basically right above the ground, and they're flying pretty fast, right? And obviously they're using a lot more fuel. Now they might have a ceiling say some feet for the rest of the mission after they drop the bomb, because if they drop below that, they might not have enough fuel to get back to the aircraft carrier. So I think that's where these economical stuff, those where those come into play, because we want to be able to get the craft, whether it's a vehicle, ground vehicle, air vehicle, back to safety within the mission space. And like Tim said, obviously a plane at 40,000 feet is going to burn less fuel than a plane at 1,000 feet, right? So going the same speed. So I think that those are really important when you're trying to run missions in an area of responsibility for the safety and welfare of the vehicle, of the people in the vehicles, and everything else.
Yeah, so one of the things on the diagram is AIP propulsion function, which it's being inherited from the propulsion system, which is the part of the submarine, right? And the whole idea there is, this is somebody that would be operating, underwater like the submarine, and that's all part of your, as I don't know if it was Jay or somebody else was talking about the economical speed specification, right? So for a submarine, a nuclear powered submarine, right? It has an economical speed specification overall for it to be able to not have to worry about refueling. But, and this is something that's not captured in this, and I don't think it needs to be, because we're trying to keep it simplistic. But you do have, when a sub, reaches its time for, the turbines or the reactor to be replaced, it's going to be out for a significant period of time.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a great point. So like if you want strategic advantage, you want to make sure, okay, we're always maintaining that we have 28 Nimitz class submarines available or something. You want to make sure that you're not going to get into a situation where we only have 25 available because 3 of them are having major components replaced. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea of, you talked about redlining and stuff like that. So the idea of, and I know we're not, we're getting a little bit into the weeds with this stuff, but the idea of that economical speed specification can be impacted on how that platform is being used, right? So if it's being used in, what would be a normal everyday type thing, whereas as opposed to it being used in battle conditions where they might be redlining different systems in the platform or in the submarine, and then all of a sudden, that's got to go into dry dock because it needs a major overhaul. And your force, your ability to bring force to bear, you don't want to you want to be able to watch out and see that, if you have 25 that, and you can do five a year or something like that, that all of a sudden you're not going to have 15 boats in dry dock.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine has he's a pilot, and he owns the fastest single prop helicopter you can own. And he was telling me, he's like, yeah, I can go 230 miles an hour in it, but I don't like to do it that often because I track the amount of revolutions that my prop does, and every certain 100,000s of revolutions or whatever, there's a certain number that he has to do a full overhaul and maintenance of the prop. So I would imagine that a lot of these parts, in aircraft and in submarines and stuff, have maintenance schedules that are sometimes based on time or based on just like an oil change. They either say you have 6 months or 3,000 miles, right? and they're equating in 3,000 miles that your cylinders have had that many revolutions or whatever, right? And so then you need an oil change. So I think that all comes into account to make sure that your Navy or your Air Force is viable, you know, in a mission space.
Well, it seems like then there might be kind of a missing connection between economical speed specification and range, because it seems like the maximum range specification here just specifies like how far can you go at this speed given how much fuel you have. But if redlining is going to possibly decrease your like mission range, then it seems like they both bear equally on like a range on paper versus like a practical range. So maybe there's teasing that out is worth thinking about.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's nuanced, you know, and how much nuance do you want to put into your ontological model? And that, I guess that's up to you. I don't know. Or it could be that you build different ontological models for the different scenarios, and then if you need to, in a certain mission space, fuse them together, you do that, right? And if they're built on object property assertions that have first order logic and sound, they should be able to fuse well together. You're not going to contradict something that's transitive or something that's functional. So those all should be able to coexist in the same model if they're done correctly.
Right.
Yeah, so the
or am I full of crap? I don't know.
No, I think you're right. So the performance specification has a part of the operating posture, which prescribes the active movement, which has a part of the speed profile, which is prescribed by the economical speed specification. So I think that we can answer John's question is, you know, how does economical speed specification relate to performance specification? Yeah, that's the way it relates. And yeah, it should relate. And then John,
yeah.
Tell us
yeah, I mean,
hugely important.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah. And also, how are they using the phrase, like, what I'd like to see more than this term, I'd like to see the definition, the genus species definition for the economical, what was it? Economical specification?
Economical speed specification.
I'd love to see the genus species definition for that, because
Jay, that's just like
we all could
you know,
be
that's like
thinking about
Jay, that's just cruise. What's your cruising speed?
No,
right?
I understand.
How are you going to get most miles?
I'm saying the word economical being an English word that has ambiguity in it. If I can see the definition, I have a better idea of exactly what they're talking about. Because I really don't care about the label, right? I care about the definition of the entity that we're discussing. Because I think we're all talking about the same thing. But I think it can be confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be as simple as, you know, if we're thinking about a car, right, where, you know, an economical speed specification could be as simple as the fuel efficiency, or it could also include everything else that we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the fuel efficiency, or it could just be a crash in the Pacific Ocean, you know.
Let me jump in for just a moment. Let me jump in for just a moment with everybody. So let's huddle up for just a second. Okay, so design patterns are often accompanied by competency questions. If you've done a good enough design pattern, you should be able to uncover competency questions from it in the reverse order. So not designing a pattern based off a competency question, but being able to sort of read off competency questions from design patterns. Design patterns are such that you can answer many competency questions with the same design pattern. And so I'm curious, what competency questions do you think this design pattern can answer? Yeah.
Jumping on the blueprint bandwagon, but it's a blueprint about a sub that is its specifications submerged underwater.
Okay. So what is, or at least some specific like that, the maximum range specification of a submerged sub underwater being 34. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I want to say that it also could answer, I mean, maybe directly, maybe indirectly, the cost of operating a sub underwater that has a maximum range specification of 34.
It's trading on what economical means.
Literally just grasping onto it
Yeah.
with your life.
Uh-huh. Yeah, Ray, and then
Yeah.
So I have a question, John. I'm sorry, is somebody else talking?
oh yeah, just a second. Go ahead, finish. Efficiency. Okay. And then we have one more and then we'll hop over with you, Mike. Yeah.
I was gonna say the specifications, like if they could give an idea of whoever was looking at this, like what exact kind of submarine that they would need in order to like conduct whatever operation.
Yeah, it might be like a search. So if you're like querying a bunch of information about subs, you say, I need something with this spec, right? Or like this submerged spec. Yeah, Mike.
So my question is, you know, we have AIP propulsion function is inherent from the propulsion system. Was that a question that was needed to be answered, right? Because the idea of having, you know, this is a propulsion system that doesn't need air to function, right? So the idea of when you're underwater, you can't be using the air from the atmosphere. But I mean, you know, it's a submarine, so it could be nuclear, it could be battery, it could be fuel cell. You know, is that something that really is this complicating the model, or is that something that was really needed?
That's a great question. Yeah, Ryan, did
We
you?
actually looked up AIPs and they only function on non-nuclear subs. So it would actually add some specification to the kind of sub.
I think Mike is. Yeah. Did you hear what Ryan said, Mike?
No, I couldn't hear him.
Okay, so Mike or Ryan was saying that these types of propulsion functions, they looked them up. These are specifically not used on nuclear subs. But then Mike, I think, is saying, is that an overcomplicating factor? Is that an overspecification of this? And Matthew, did you want?
Yeah, I wanted to say no, because this, as dumb as it sounds, I don't know enough about submarines to know that they can move without using the propulsion system. Can they somehow, you know, does the ocean provide enough current? Is there something that they can do where part of the economical speed specification could also include some non-propulsion movement that then factors into this overall cost or whatever analysis?
Well, let me take this as a kickoff point to the next question I want to ask. There's another set of questions, or at least a question you should have in mind right after, or maybe in tandem when you ask about the sort of competency questions of design pattern. So now I want to ask you, and this gets to what Mike was pointing to, I think, what competency questions would this not be able to answer? Nearby relevant competency questions that involve subs and stuff like that. So don't start talking about birds with arms or whatever, but like so relevant, what sort of competency questions nearby can this not answer? And I'll say one more thing. Keep in mind, we're not talking about like our interpretation. We're talking about machines. You got to be really specific. When you're talking about machines, they do exactly what you tell them. They answer exactly what they can. So, Matthew, with that.
Well, kind of what I was talking about earlier is to not tell me actually how a sub moves.
Sure. Yeah.
Like at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
It also doesn't give you the total specification of the sub. It's only submerged.
That's right.
So you wouldn't know any of it's operating above the surface of the water.
I think, Mike, you probably have some questions that it can't answer as well in mind. If you want to jump in, I just want to give you the opportunity if you'd like to. Or anybody really on the call.
Yeah, I mean the idea that, you know, we have a platform, and yeah, we're getting out the speed, right? But you know, and you know, now that it was said that this would be non-nuclear, right? The range is something that we have no idea of, right? So you know, and certainly if we're using an AIP propulsion system, right, we're talking about a very limited ability to operate submerged.
So, like to Mike's point, if this, and to Ryan's point too, if this is specific to nuclear or non-nuclear stuff, there's a question you can't answer, right? You're not going to use this to answer questions about nuclear, so submerged motion or speed. Yeah.
We don't know if it would use the same propulsion or movement to become submerged as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So stop maximum, again, going back to range, but
Mhm.
it says 34 knots. But we don't really know what the 34 knot really means. Like, is it going in a
Straight
is it
line.
going vertically? Like
Mhm.
it's deploying ballast and it's
Mhm.
flying back to the surface. That using the propulsion to
Mhm.
go
Linearly, yeah, yeah.
or
Whatever that means in three-dimensional space. Yeah.
Traveling
Yeah.
along.
Yeah. So yeah, good. Okay, so let me say
Well,
so.
there's also model we're missing, John,
Mhm.
and it's probably a model that the Navy has
Mhm.
or they know of, which is what temperature, whatever. What are the parameters that things are tested for maximum range and distance and speed, right? And I'm guessing that for aircraft, there's probably an altitude that they have as a baseline.
Yep.
For vehicles, there's probably a surface or something that's a baseline. But if you don't know those baselines, you're kind of just sort of throwing coins into a can or something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to highlight this. Okay, so this is an important point. So when you're looking at design patterns, there's some kind of litmus tests you can use to evaluate them. One is, can I construct competency questions out of these? Like that makes sense. And it seems like this is one you can construct competency questions out of. I think that's now then the next question is, what can't you say? What can you not say that you might think you should say? So this is a balancing act because we can't. What we don't want to do, there's like a trade-off. What you don't want to do is, if you can get away with it, is spell out all of the specific details of everything that would possibly go on. Maybe ultimately in the future, that is what we want to aim for. I mean, I do. But when you're creating a design pattern, it's supposed to be somewhat generalizable. It's supposed to answer a wide range of questions. So the more specific you get, the narrower this range of questions you can answer becomes. Because you can think of it as becoming a fragile design pattern. And each slight change, like asserting that this is non-nuclear, like rules out a whole class of measurements, right? Like you can't talk about nuclear stuff. You just have to keep that in mind. Sometimes that's fine. But it is a balancing act. You also don't want to have it so abstract that you can't even construct competence. Because if I dropped everything off other than performance spec, PICE, and maximum specification or range specification, in the abstract, I could answer all sorts of questions, but a machine wouldn't be able to use that at all. It's almost useless. It's too abstract. And so there is a balancing act in mind. And so the way in to get there is thinking or working with subject matter experts more specifically about the sorts of the breadth of competency questions this could answer versus the other the breadth it can't answer. There's a bit of a ratio juggling that goes on. You may also think, and keep this in mind when you see things that a design pattern can't answer, does that mean I need a new design pattern? Or should I complicate this design pattern to accommodate those sorts of additional cases? Right? It's a balancing act. Okay. You see that? And we can have modules and patterns that sit beside each other and weave together and complement one another. This is from a suite of design patterns that complement one another. And in the broader suite, there's a whole range of questions that can be answered that are kind of missing from here. But it's a choice, right? And one of the other reasons, I'll just emphasize this. One of the other reasons why we don't want to boil the ocean in specificity is, one, we can't. Two, you got to keep in mind that we're not the only people using this. We often have to hand these things off to developers who don't want all these edges and nodes. Now, I'm of the opinion that we should have the full whole cloth that we can cut from. And that is but nevertheless, I still keep in mind when I'm creating design patterns or ontologies in general, I have to at least create simplified patterns for developers. And so I am also thinking when I have something like this in mind, how hard is it for me to construct a simplified pattern that I can map back into for developers? And that really informs the way I construct design patterns because it's part of a bigger ecosystem. Mike, you've been waiting patiently. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that we were talking about competency questions that it can answer and competency. I'm thinking, this is what took me a while to answer that before is that I'm looking at submerged status and active movement, and I'm looking at this if you try to replicate it for other platforms in the ocean, right? Like a ship or something like that, right? So would you be able to have values for submerged stasis of like, afloat or docked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in active movement, also have defined those movements as either sailing or, I don't know, maybe docked, right? To complement that submerged stasis, or is that complicating this too much?
I think so if maybe I'm not tracking, but and maybe I was just hearing what I wanted to hear, so correct me. But I was thinking you're pointing to sort of like a strategy, or at least a thought about modularization of an existing design pattern. So some of the stuff that you see here can be stripped off and would be common and used for other design patterns for like non-AIP propulsion functions, or like non-submarines, right? For like boats, like they're still going to have performance specifications and maximum range and operating postures, right? Like, so you can still keep parts of this and you can add in more specific content to the design pattern, right? And so there's something about there's reuse throughout. And so you don't have to think about this as black and white. You think about these as parts of a bigger whole. And so the complicating factor would be, of course, adding the specificity in. But if we're doing that with an eye towards what's common across design patterns, much like we do when we're building ontology content, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. That really is going to minimize or at least mitigate some of the complication because we get to reuse patterns. And we see these patterns all over the place. Is that so? Forgive me if I've
Yeah,
just
John,
what I was wanting to. But yeah.
No, I was saying the same thing when we were broken out.
Mhm.
Like the way I look at everything might be different because I've been running like a foundry for 4
Mhm.
years. And so I try to look at what's going to be interconnected with other groups, right? And if you're just working in mission space, you're really just working on like, how do I solve this mission critical question or solve this problem today? But really, when you're in the mission space, you need to be looking at, what can I reuse? Or if you find something missing, you have to ask yourself, is this just inherent to my problem, or is this something that's inherent to multiple problems? And maybe it doesn't belong to live way down here in the
Yeah.
basement. It needs to move up to the main floor. I think that's really important because, like, at the root of it, I think that if you take, vehicle, and you say, okay, there's always going to be an active movement and a process about movement, and then there's going to be probably a concretized, there's going to be information content entities that are concretized off of the process of movement, like, oh, we're going a certain speed or something. Like there's really basic elements here that are going to now go out to like thousands of different models.
Right.
And we want to make sure that we don't nest those elements that need to be in these more general models down in one of these sub domain models.
Agreed. But so before we close, we're a little over time. I just want to make sure, Mike, hopefully I didn't distort your question too much, your comment too much. I just want to give you some space to,
It's similar to what I think that was Jay was talking is that, we have submerged stasis, and I was thinking that, whether you use this for a submarine or you use it for a destroyer class or you use it for, I don't know, a rubber dinghy or something like that, right? Could you, have the values for submerged stasis or rename that as something that would be common across different platforms. So, I don't have a problem with using submerged stasis and then having, the values for that being, docked, submerged, afloat, sunk.
Yeah. No, I get it. So, and I think what Mike's pointing to, and Jay's pointing to, and You know, I hope so, but because I'm certainly pointing to this, is the importance of the structure rather than labels. So relabeling, like you said, you could relabel, but really it's the structure that's the important. The structure is the usable part, and some structure lives higher up because it's more reusable. Some structure lives low down because it's reused less, but still nonetheless important. And with that, because we're over time, see you later. I guess I gotta get ready for the next class, but great. This is productive.